The Shep Naz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shep Naz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. And we want to wish you a happy Easter Monday. We had wonderful services over the weekend, and we are looking forward to starting a new week with the new energy from Easter. And with that, we're going to be looking into the idea of evangelism and what does it mean to reach out to others and share the gospel. And so Pastor Rob's in here today, and we're want to tackle this. All right, so welcome in, Pastor Rob.
Thank you. Good to be here. And it was a great day yesterday. Easter was awesome. Got to baptize some people and celebrate their new life in Christ, and so we're super excited about that. And, kind of speaking about new life in Christ, it's been on my just kind of heart for a while to kind of bring an emphasis to evangelism back to the church and talk about that a little bit more. So we have a class coming up starting this Wednesday on evangelism, and we're going to talk about that in a couple episodes as well. But wanted to kind of just bring this topic out and just kind of get it out there for you to start thinking about, let it simmer in your heart and your mind a little bit. And I wanted to share something that was really interesting. So I recently started in a preaching collaborative. It's kind of funny. I was on a prayer retreat and felt like the Lord was saying, you need to work on that. And while I was on the prayer retreat, I got a call from Sam, our DS. I don't know if I talked about this or not. And
I think you mentioned it, but you didn't go into any
so he's
detail.
We got this thing going on, and we're just really kind of trying to tighten up the preaching in the church. And so we have pastors who are going through this, and then they'll lead other pastors through it. And like for you to go through it. So I'm like, well, I was just praying about it, and the Lord said I should work on this. And then you called me and said I should work on this. And, my family tells me every Sunday after church I should work on this. So it was like,
If I recall, you said you were out in the middle of a field in Logan.
I was, at Camp Katubik on just a prayer retreat, sitting in the cornfield, praying, looking up at the sky. And Sam called me then. And then, so anyhow, what I'm doing is I'm meeting with 6 other pastors every other week, and we read books, watch videos, discuss this stuff. We have homework and all that kind of stuff. My next homework assignment is I have to find 20 people in the church who will listen to my sermons with a evaluative ear, and then fill out these.
Not critical, but valuative.
Evaluative, maybe critical is a better word. I don't know. To see if I'm actually applying the things that I'm supposed to be learning. So,
all right.
But anyway, I said all that to say, in this class there was a lesson from Dr. Busick, who is one of our general superintendents, and he kind of started the thing off, and he gave a message called "It's not 1964 anymore." And it was good. I'm going to share this with the board and the staff, and I'm going to share it with here today on the podcast, some of it. But I want to show the whole video because it's really, really powerful. But he began the video by saying, imagine that there's a scale from 1 to 10, and 1 being, I don't know Jesus and I don't care about Jesus. 10 being, I'm ready to accept Jesus and surrender my life to him now. And the question was, in 1964, where do you think most people were on that scale? And the answer was that he said there was a study, and sociologists figured that they were an 8. And so in 1964, the average unchurched person on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not saved, don't care, 10 being ready to give my life to the Lord, they were living at an 8. And he talked about some of the cultural things that were present that made people more open to the gospel. One of those things was in 1964, there was just an acceptance that of the deity of Jesus, that he was, an honorable person, and he was more than a prophet. He had given his life, and there was just an acceptance that most people accepted that. There was also a general acceptance from everyone then that truth existed. Like there was definitely a right and a wrong. It was defined by the Bible, and it was defined by our set of moral standards that came from our Judeo-Christian values.
And the truth of that day, it was understood that everybody agreed on the same truth.
Right.
There was one truth, and that was the truth.
Correct. Yeah.
And everybody agreed on that.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about all these steps, if there's 10 steps to going from non-Christian to Christian, then these people that you're talking to in 1964, they've already are at step 8 before you even start talking to them.
Correct. Some of those other things were that the Bible was trustworthy, back in the day, back in 1964. And I think it was, if I'm remembering right, it was 1963 when prayer was kicked out of school. So in 1963, prior to, just before 1963, every kid prayed a prayer in school, asking God to bless their teachers, their parents, their family, and their city, and their government. So there was all of that. But the Bible was trustworthy. Like, Billy Graham could open the Bible and say, the Bible says, and people are like, oh, wait, what does the Bible say? I need to know that. There was this level of alertness to it, and it's like they trusted it, and today that doesn't exist. Back then, there was a level of trust in the church, that the church was looking out for my good. The church cared about me, and church leaders weren't crooked. Church leaders weren't, immoral or any of that kind of stuff. There was just that kind of thing. And then there was just this basic knowledge of essential truths of the Christian faith. Like, most people knew wrong and right, and what sin was, and who God was, and who Jesus was, and that going to church was the right thing to do or an immoral thing to do. And they had this built-in sense of conviction that existed in their life when they violated the basic tenets of the Christian faith. It was like, if I did, if I did something that kind of violated the truth, it was like I felt guilty about it, and I knew that I did something. There was this, because our culture honored those kinds of things. And he says, those things don't really exist anymore.
Right.
And he talked about how when, and the reason he chose 1964, because that's the year he was born. Sure. And he was talking about all these things, that happened in 1964. The Vietnam War was going on, all this stuff. And he said, but the most important thing in 1964 is I was born. And he talked about his childhood. He said, I went to school, and I saw my teachers in my public school started the day with prayer. And he said, and I saw my teachers from the public school in church on Sunday morning. He said, I go out into the neighborhood, and if I did something wrong, my neighbors told my parents, and I didn't get away with it. And so he's just talking about how different it was. And so then on a scale of 1 to 10, 1, I'm not saved, I don't want to be saved, and 10 being I'm ready to give my life to Jesus, most people lived at an 8, right? Mm-hmm. And so what he was saying is that because most people lived at an 8, there were certain things that the church did that were effective then that the church can't do today. And one of the examples, he says, you could go door to door. And this church used to do that. I've heard stories about it when we'd meet at a certain time, and we would go door to door, and we would knock on people's door, and we would share the gospel. In 1964, you could knock on the door, and someone opened it. That may not even happen today, but so they'd open the door and they say, hey, I'm from the church down the street and just wanted to talk to you. And people would invite them in, sit down, have a conversation, and you could share the gospel, and people got saved that way.
I can remember in the late 80s, even into the early 90s, I can remember Tuesday nights we would have evangelism night, and we would literally take a look at, what the neighborhood, and we'd canvass a neighborhood, knock on some doors. And that was in the midst of evangelism explosion. And we'd sit there and say, if you were to die today and go to heaven and say, God would ask you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? Yeah. And everyone would, you could talk to somebody about that. It'd be a complete stranger, and they would have that conversation with you. That's not the same world we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, if you go knock on someone's door today and say, I'd like to talk to you about God, there's a very good chance, first, they're not going to answer the door because they don't know you. Second of all, because they got the Ring doorbell and the video camera, like, I don't know who's at the door, I'm not answering it. And second of all, I mean, they're not wanting to talk to you about God, because what's happened is we've privatized God. God's no longer a public thing, he's private. And I'm like, I'm not going to talk to you about my beliefs in God. So they just wouldn't do that.
I want to live like you and see people how you see them.
I want your mission to be my mission.
I don't want to shrink back from the big questions. Help me to listen deeply as you would.
God, so many things try to hold us back, but let your love speak louder than fear.
By your Spirit, Lord, remind me I don't have to be who I'm not. I can connect compassionately out of who you made me to be, even out of my brokenness.
Lead me as I share the simple gospel.
Refresh me in the midst of resistance.
Fill me with fresh vision for the next generation.
And let me know the joy of connecting the people you love back to you.
Fear and discouragement can cause us to shrink back from sharing the good news, but spiritual openness is rising in the U.S. God is calling us to remember why He sent His Son, not to condemn the world, but to save it. If you'd like to learn more how to share your faith or sharpen up your skills on how to share Jesus with others, please join Pastor Rob starting Wednesday, April 3rd in the sanctuary for an 8-week class on sharing your faith. This 8-part video-driven course is full of inspiring stories and actionable challenges from 18 amazing contributors.
So some of those methods that we used back then, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I'm saying they're not as effective today. But back then, a person opened the door, they were at an 8.
Right.
Now you do that, they're not at an 8. Another thing, we'd had revivals, and we have revivals here. We have one scheduled in November. But they were effective because people had this basic sense of, I should go to church. So when my friends invited me to church, I would go, and they're already at an 8. So when the preacher comes in and says, if you don't get saved, you're going to go to hell. Well, I don't want to go to hell. I'm going to get saved. And so people would, it was easier. I'm not saying that it was easy then and it's hard now. I'm saying it's different now than it was then.
Well, one of the points that he made that kind of stuck out to me is he said, it was easier to evangelize in the church in that during that time period,
right?
Because non-Christians would come to church because because of their upbringing or whatever, they knew they were supposed to show up at church, and so even if they might not be a believer, giving a gospel call, giving a salvation call at a regular church service was more effective back in those times because non-Christians were more likely to actually attend a church service.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Yeah. So, and today it's not, what are you saying? The church was an effective method for evangelism, and it's not as effective today. Another example that he used that I love this example, he said back in 1964, you could, if your church had a big yellow bus, you could roll down the neighborhood and you could stop at people's houses that you didn't know. You could have a man get off of the bus and go up to somebody's house and knock on the door and say, hey, I'm from the church down the street. Can we take your kid to church? And he said people would actually let their kid go up with the man they didn't know, get on a bus and go to the church down the road, and they could indoctrinate them or talk to them about the gospel, and then to be trusted to bring their kid back. He said, if you drive up in front of somebody's house today with a yellow bus and you get out and you knock on somebody's door and say, hey, I go to the church, can I take your kid to church? He said, there's a good chance you'd get shot or someone would call the police on you,
sure.
And and I'm not saying that, in the day that worked. This church had it. I think we had a big blue bus. I've heard stories about it. I was brought to church on a bus. Yeah. But we, first of all, it's pretty hard to have a bus nowadays because of all the regulations and everything. But you just couldn't go up to the house and somebody isn't just going to say, yeah, you can take my kid to church.
I know personal story from my mom. She was the product of a bus ministry. Some bus came and picked her up, and she just asked mom and dad, "Can I go?" And they're like, "Whatever." And so
sure, just have them back by dinner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And she got on the bus, went to Vacation Bible School. That's how she found Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess the whole point that Dr. Busick was making is that it's not 1964 anymore, right? He even said, talked about Gen X, which I'm a part of that generation. He says that generation, Gen X, is the first generation to grow up in a post-Christian context. And prior to that generation, people born, in the before the 60s or mid 60s would have grown up in a Christian context where those things were kind of given because people are already innate. But now everything is different. Truth is not accepted by this everybody as the same thing. You hear things like my truth, your truth. The Bible isn't necessarily trusted like it was. Church leaders and churches aren't trusted like they were. The basic knowledge of Christian faith doesn't exist in people. He said that today, 72% of people deny that truth even exists. 30% of the people today don't even know what the gospel means if you say the word gospel to them. And he said literally, and he goes, I'm not joking about this, 10% of people today think that Noah's wife was Joan of Arc.
Right.
And I mean, so it's just that. And so then he goes and he says, so here's the deal. In 1964, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you ask people where most people were, they were an 8, ready. They were very close to accepting the gospel. Today, if you ask sociologists in this same study today, they find that most people are a 2 or a 3 when it comes to that.
Sure.
So 1 meaning I don't know God and I don't care about it. 10 meaning I'm ready to give my life to him. Most people that we have relationships and interact with today that are not already a part of the church are at a 2. And what he's saying is that we if we want to win people to Jesus, we have to do things differently. We can't just do what we did before, because what we did before doesn't work. And while it may be that some of those things would work with some people, the truth is that they don't always work today.
And maybe what a 2 looks like is somebody that says, well, there might be a God. There might be a higher power.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm not totally excluding the possibility. Mm-hmm. That'd be a 0.
Right.
But you're starting at such a basic level at this point. Like, I don't know. I'm not saying there isn't a God, but I don't even know for sure that there is one.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the good news of the podcast today, right? Is that we don't live in 1964 anymore. There's a lot of good to that, but there's a lot of challenges that the church faces today that the church didn't face. Now, the church faced challenges in 1964, but they're different. And what I'd like to do tomorrow is talk about how those implications of the changes that our culture has experienced affects the church and how the church needs to respond. And then we'll talk some more about this upcoming class that we have coming up.
All right. So that was a little bit of a reality check today of just recognizing how things have changed over the past few decades and where we are for the church. We don't want you to be discouraged. That's not where the story ends.
Right.
I heard a saying earlier today. It says you can look at a situation and say, look at what the world has come to, or you can say, look at what has come to the world. And so we are looking at what has come to the world. Jesus has come, and we're ready to share. So you can check out everything that's going on in the church by going to shepnaz.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.